Welcome back to Washington Journal. We're joined now on the set by Curtis Wilkie. He's co-author of this book. The cover of this book, Jim McDougal and Curtis Wilkie. The book is titled Arkansas Mischief, The Birth of a National Scandal. Curtis Wilkie, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Lou.
How'd this book come about?
Well, I think Jim McDougal wanted to tell his story, and he was heading off to prison, so it was going to be difficult to do it from there. And so his agent approached me about helping him. And I have to say that when they first came at me, I wasn't interested. I thought that McDougal, had real credibility problems, was something of a kook. And they insisted that I go see him, and I went to Arkadelphia about a week before he went into prison and found that he was really a very charming, bright, well-informed, well-read guy with a good sense of humor and a fascinating story to tell. And most importantly, I found that he was credible, and so I agreed to help him. And Jim went off to prison. He would call me every morning about 7. I would tape record these conversations for about a half an hour, then I would transcribe them. And for conversations that we felt were too sensitive to talk about on a monitored phone, I went and visited him in prison 7 different times, and hence the book.
Why did they come to you?
Good question. I think because I'm Southern, because I have an understanding, I hope, of politics. And I was recommended to them by a friend of mine who's a novelist in Boston named George Higgins. And he said it would be a good fit, and I hope it was. Jim and I hit it off. We had a lot in common. Turns out, I thought Jim was in his 70s and discovered he was exactly the same age as I am.
We'd like you to join us with your questions and comments. This is a book that you may have heard about in the news that's just out. It's Arkansas Mischief, The Birth of a National Scandal by Jim McDougal and Curtis Wilkie. Curtis Wilkie with us here for about the next 25 minutes or so. In your opening comments, you said you met Jim McDougal and was intrigued with the story he had to tell. What's the story that he tells with your help in this book?
Well, the story is far deeper and broader than Whitewater. The book basically covers about 50 years in Arkansas political history, and Jim I discovered was a real player in that for 40 years. He knew all the important figures in Arkansas, worked with many of them, was business partners with some of them, including Bill Clinton. He wanted to put the whole Whitewater story into context of that, and the Whitewater case is not even addressed until the book has reached its halfway point. And then, there are the stories that have created some of the news lately. There are allegations by Jim that he has not made public before that while Bill Clinton was governor, he passed $2,000 a month under the table to him to ensure that favorable appointments would be made to regulatory agencies, because Jim wanted to expand his savings and loan and banking businesses into other parts of Arkansas. The other major new allegation is that Bill Clinton promised Jim McDougal that he would pardon Susan McDougal if she were convicted, and after that pardon failed to materialize, that was one of the factors that led Jim to cooperate with Ken Starr and the Independent Counsel's Office.
The President's attorney, David Kendall, has issued a statement, which you've seen, and the statement is, for Mr. Kendall, I know for a fact that Mr. McDougal's statement about his conversation with the President on April 28, 1996 is absolutely false. Mr. McDougal was in Washington, D.C. that day to attend the President's videotaped deposition. I was with the President every moment he was in the presence of Mr. McDougal, precisely to assure that no one could ever credibly make an outlandish allegation like this. It did not happen. There's no point in responding to each of the other scurrilous falsehoods in Mr. McDougal's book, however much they may help hype sales. Many of them, for example, the statement that the President knew about the David Hale loan to Susan McDougal, are directly contrary to Mr. McDougal's sworn testimony at his 1996 trial. The others, such as the $2,000 a month cash payments, are simply made up out of whole cloth. If these charges are representatives of the rest of the book, it properly belongs on the fiction side of the aisle. From David Kendall.
Sure.
Just your thoughts.
Yeah, well, obviously when we wrote the book, we expected that Jim McDougal would be alive to be representing it and not me. And I can't deal with David Kendall's claim that he was with the president at every nanosecond, as he said, during that day at the White House. Jim would have. Jim wouldn't have put it in the book if he didn't expect to have to deal with these things. It's essentially Jim McDougal's word against Bill Clinton's on a couple of these points. I will say that there are certain allegations in here that can be supported by fact that the White House will tend to call scurrilous, and in fact, the Independent Counsel's Office has evidence that the president lied when he denied taking a loan from Jim McDougal's Savings and Loan. That I know, and that's in the book.
You write in the preface, after you met Jim McDougal and got to know him a little bit, there was the line I noticed. You said, "I decided he was believable." What was there about what he told you and how he told you that made you decide he was believable?
Well, one is his manner. You can generally look at people in the eye and determine whether they're lying or not. And for the things that I was able to check out on my own, every one of them checked out. There were stories that he told that were 40 years old, and I would go to other people to make sure they were right, and they proved to be accurate, right down to quotes. And secondly, I talked to friends and colleagues who had covered Whitewater extensively and who knew Jim McDougal, and every one of them said that Jim McDougal was reliable and had never misled them.
Curtis Wilkie has been with the Boston Globe since 1975, and he's been based in New Orleans since 1993. He's a national reporter for the Globe and co-author of the new book, Arkansas Mischief, The Birth of a National Scandal, with us for about 20 more minutes. Destin, Florida, good morning.
Good morning. A lot of people, I think, would lie when they know they're going to prison for 84 years. And it's funny how fate plays tricks on us. He's not here to say over and over again what he thinks about President Clinton. He is in the wrong, and this gentleman, of course, wants to sell books, but we're all tired of hearing about what happened to President Clinton. It's never been proven, and he's dead, and so it will never be proven.
Thanks for your points. Curtis Wilkie?
Well, if you don't want to read it, nobody's going to force you to read it. But Jim McDougal wanted to get the story out, and I think there is some interest in it. I have to stress that, whatever I am, I'm not part of what Mrs. Clinton called the, quote, vast right-wing conspiracy, close quote, that's out to get President Clinton. I happen to like President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton and have had a professional relationship with them down through the years, and so I'm not out to get them. It's just that they happen to be characters in the Jim McDougal story.
Lexington, Kentucky. Good morning.
Good morning. How you doing?
Good.
Good. Listen, I'd like to tell this gentleman, I really admire a Southerner for crying out loud for speaking up for the truth. I really admire the South for being as conservative as they are. This guy we got in the White House, I don't know. He's a 3-time draft dodger. He's an admitted adulterer. And then he's sold the pretty much what he do, sell that plot for $240,000. Or you can move right in there next to the unknown soldier. Then he's going to go put a wreath on it, for crying out loud. Really what it comes down to is that you can't run a pig on a racetrack. It's really, and 10,000 Frenchmen can't all be wrong.
Thanks, Lexington. Let's go ahead and take another call for Curtis Wilkie. Chesapeake, Virginia. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'm calling to ask Mr. Wilkie, or to disagree with Mr. Wilkie's statement that this is just a matter of Mr. Hale's word against the president. Not Mr. Hale. Mr. McDougal's word against the president. Susan McDougal, who is, I think most Americans find extremely credible, whose story has not changed one iota in all of this time and through all her travail, exactly agrees with what the president's lawyer said. In fact, she had the very conversations with her husband as to his motives for doing what he was doing. He even tried to get her to do it in order to basically save their skins and get them out of jail, and cooperate with Ken Starr. So the American people, this is not just coming in a vacuum. Susan McDougal is extremely believable. Her story hasn't changed one bit.
Thanks, Chesapeake.
Well, I'm not sure what Susan McDougal's story is, quite frankly, because she's, chosen not to speak out, and that's her prerogative. Now, I will say that Jim McDougal is quite protective of her. The book is largely sympathetic to Susan McDougal. Jim tried to encourage her to cooperate in order not to have to go to prison at all, and she chose not to do that.
Elmira, New York, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN.
Thanks for the call.
Hi. I'd like to ask the author, please, if he has in any way, directly or indirectly, been contacted by the independent counsel's office, Ken Starr, or any of their compatriots in terms of his efforts with this book.
No, ma'am. There were basically three parties to the conflict that I tried to avoid and did avoid in doing the book because it's Jim McDougal's story. And I did not talk to anyone in the independent counsel's office. I didn't attempt to talk to anybody at the White House, and I did not attempt to talk to Susan McDougal.
The book is dedicated to Claudia Riley for her care and strength, and to Carter, Layton, and Stewart for their support, who are Claudia Riley, Carter, Layton, and Stewart.
Well, Claudia Riley was Jim's good friend. Her late husband, Bob Riley, was one of Jim's mentors, and it was on the Riley property where Jim lived for much of the last years of his life. Claudia Riley arranged for his funeral. I'm proud to say that Carter, Layton, and Stewart are my children.
Our next call is from Greenville, South Carolina.
Hi. I enjoy C-SPAN and commend the gentleman for writing the book. I like Jim McDougal. I believe he was a credible person. And I'm wondering the people that are opposing Susan McDougal, because she was indicted, if I'm not mistaken, from stealing money, embezzling from a savings and loan, and the taxpayers had to pay this. And I don't see how they can do that, but I'm going to read his book. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Every little bit helps.
Clarksville, Tennessee. Good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Mr. Wilkie, I have a question for you. You mentioned that you checked out a story that Mr. McDougal told you that happened 40 years ago that was true. How did that relate to President Clinton 40 years ago?
Well, as I said, the book is not designed to be a polemic against President Clinton. It's a book about Jim McDougal's life and times in Arkansas politics, and that really started when he was a young kid running a local campaign for Adlai Stevenson in 1956 in his little hometown of Bradford, Arkansas.
In the opening of this, he writes, Jim McDougal writes, I grew up in an era when Arkansas was represented by honorable men, Fulbright, John McClellan, and Wilbur Mills. Though they were imperfect, their word was bond. They followed a traditional code of political conduct that seemed to disappear with the nickel bottle of Coca-Cola. Their generation gave way to a new breed of leaders, articulate, bold, and most importantly, telegenic. Clinton and Tucker were exemplars of the modern school of Arkansas politics, overachievers determined to get ahead regardless of the cost. With them, deals were too often consummated with a wink instead of a firm handshake. They were my contemporaries, and I was a con artist in their company. Why do you think of himself as a con artist?
Oh, Jim, I think, kind of reveled in the idea of being a real character. That's why he dressed so flamboyantly. He actually wanted to name the book at one time Con Men, and happily we came up with a better title than that. But Jim, throughout the book, he doesn't claim to be anything other than what he was, a guy who did lie at times, who was involved in some shady deals, but basically here at the end of his life wanted to lay it all out on the table.
And in the opening here, in the next to the last paragraph before the start of the first chapter, he writes, I don't feel terribly penitent. I prefer to think of myself as a good pirate in the tradition of Southern populace, quick to bend the law to defy the establishment. Georgetown, Texas, good morning.
Yes, good morning. Mr. Wilkie, the old adage goes, where there's smoke, there's fire. I think in Mr. Clinton's case, it could turn out to be a bonfire. Considering all the accusations through the years, how do you account for his ability to evade all these charges? Is it part of the incestuous Arkansas political machine, or is he just that lucky?
I think Bill Clinton is probably the best politician I've ever known and covered. I covered his campaign in 1992, where he had to fight off allegations that would have sunk any other campaign, whether it was the Gennifer Flowers case or the matter of I didn't inhale or dodging the draft. He's very adroit, but he's resilient, he's strong, and it's a very impressive characteristic.
About 10 minutes left with Curtis Wilkie, who's a national reporter for the Boston Globe and co-author of Arkansas Mischief, The Birth of a National Scandal. Next call is from Las Vegas. Good morning.
Hi, I'm really interested in politics as a young American, and I applaud Curtis Wilkie for his book. And I think it's important that we get these truths out about President Clinton. I really honestly believe that they are truths, that they're just allegations that have been covered up by Washington. People are crazy if they honestly believe that a person of this much power in the world cannot cover up certain allegations. And I just want to applaud you for your book, and I'm really getting tired of the supposedly the highest power in the world being let go with all these allegations, and they're obviously true. And it just really irritates me that we're actually ashamed of the White House right now. At least I know I am. And I think something really needs to change.
Thanks for the call. Shaker Heights, Ohio. Good morning.
Mr. Wilkie, do you think that Mr. McDougal's death was due to the fact that Mr. Starr jailed him? And I understand he was in solitary confinement. Do you think, I didn't know he had any kind of a heart problem. I knew he had mental problems. But do you think his death was hastened by this?
His imprisonment probably didn't help him, and unfortunately he was in solitary when he was stricken and when he died, but he was in very poor health. A doctor had testified at his sentencing that he had the body of a man 20 years older than he was. He was manic depressive, and he was taking medication for that. He had blocked arteries. He was taking medication for that. He had a history of a stroke, had other seizures. So, quite frankly, he felt he probably wouldn't survive prison, and I think he was very fatalistic and knew he probably didn't have long to live, and that's why he was in such a rush to get this book out.
Oxford, Alabama. Good morning.
Good morning. I read two articles recently, one of them in Media Bypass, and I don't know if you've touched on this since I've had your program turned off waiting to be on, but there's a consensus with the prisoners. I believe one of the cellmates with Mr. McDougal was a man named Hayes, and also when he was transferred to Fort Worth, there's an interview that was done that said that a helicopter had landed, unmarked military helicopter outside the prison about 3 hours before Mr. McDougal's death, and that he was in good spirits, jovial when he had supper that afternoon, and then when he was taken to his cell sometime after that, within a couple of hours, he was taken out and given a diuretic, which was against the instructions of his doctor, giving his condition, physical and medical condition, and then some hour or so after that, he was in his cell dead. What do you think? The chances are that this man was murdered.
Well, I would hope that nothing like that happened. I certainly have no evidence that anything like that happened. I think it was terribly unfortunate that he was in solitary when he was stricken. I've been contacted by a few of the inmates who have suggested that something improper may have happened there at the Fort Worth prison, but I have no evidence myself.
Canton, Illinois. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to ask Mr. Wilkie if he could tell us what business Susan McDougal's brothers are in, and are they getting any kind of contracts from someone? Is this why she won't talk?
Jim McDougal told me that this had been raised by the independent counsel's office in their conversations with him. I know nothing about this for a fact myself, but he said that the investigators were looking into some of the contracts that were going to a couple of Susan McDougal's brothers because it appeared to be similar to the contracts that were channeled to Webb Hubbell following his conviction.
Fayetteville, Arkansas. Good morning.
You know, I'd like to comment on Mr. Wilkie's being conned by Jim McDougal. Do you think that you may have been conned by McDougal just like a lot of other people have, Mr. Wilkie?
Well, I hope not. I think I saw Jim for what he was, and he's a mischievous fellow, but as I said, everything that I could check out myself proved to be accurate, so I don't think so.
A couple of faxes that we have in is Bill, is it McCarthy, I think, in Virginia Beach. The book represents Jim McDougal's deathbed confession. Such confessions are considered strong evidence in a court of law, especially when statements made by Mr. McDougal are corroborated by Mr. Wilkie's investigation. This book should be given a lot of weight. And then this is a note from Mike Hicks in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Writes, one of the 24-hour news networks has had Susan McDougal on the telephone live from prison spewing venom at Ken Starr, stating unequivocally that she is standing on principle and will only speak to the Congress or another special prosecutor about what she knows regarding Whitewater. Knowing what you do, Mr. Wilkie, do you believe that Ms. McDougal is a patriot and a martyr, and should she be awarded any special consideration?
Well, I don't know Susan McDougal, and I don't really know how to judge her position. I think being a stand-up woman is somewhat admirable. Jim had affection for her. They had a troubled marriage, but Jim, to the last day he lived, was fond of her, and certainly it's her prerogative to refuse to testify, and Jim, I think, appreciated that.
Trenton, New Jersey. Good morning.
Good morning. I wasn't going to speak about Susan McDougal, but I think that she's still waiting for a presidential pardon, and that's how come she's been so hard, and her position is hardened as time has gone on. I've been trying to get through for weeks because I want to speak about that letter full of dirt that was put into a phone booth on Dan Burton, and I was wondering, am I the only person in the country that sees any connection between that and the 900 files that were taken from the FBI by the White House earlier? And one more thing I want to ask is, isn't it strange that the same prison that Jim McDougal died in, was the genesis of that supposed writing by Jim McDougal that Geraldo has been waving around on his show?
Curtis Wilkie, any observations?
I'm not sure I can handle that one. Some of it, it's not germane to the book. So I think I'll give that one a pass.
How long did you work on the book?
We started it at last June, about the time Jim went into prison, and we finished it about 2 weeks before his death, which we finished it in late February. He died March the 8th.
And it's been out how long?
Just about exactly a week.
Next call is Troy, Michigan. Good morning.
Good morning. I love C-SPAN. Mr. Wilkie, I find it quite interesting that the gentleman that Mr. McDougal said gave the president $2,000 a month or a week or whatever it was happened to have been dead at the time that he gave you the information, so there is no way that you could have corroborated that. I also think that people are misreading your story, because if you say that the president isn't even discussed until the middle of the book, I think it's unfair to be talking about the president constantly. You should be talking about what a scam artist Jim McDougal was.
Well, Jim McDougal talks about what a con artist he was in the book. There's plenty of that.
What do you hope people get from reading this?
Yeah, I hope beyond the ephemeral headlines that it's had over the last few days, that people will be able to read it years from now as a portrait of Southern politics, of Arkansas politics, of the culture and folkways that produced President Clinton and people like Jim McDougal, other characters in this drama that's been running for about 6 years now.
Curtis Wilkie is national reporter for the Boston Globe, has been with the Globe since 1975, currently based in New Orleans. He's the co-author of this book, along with Jim McDougal, Arkansas Mischief, The Birth of a National Scandal. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you.
We'll be right back.